US and Iran on the path of dangerous escalation or calculated brinkmanship. How does this affect internal politics with Iran? How does it affect regional players and conflict? And what stakes exist onlooking the GCC, for the onlooking GCC nations? In order to address these pivotal issues, we are pleased to be joined by our four esteemed panelists. I will start introducing them from right to left. Dr. Trita Parsi is the Executive Director of the newly launched Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Of course, prior to his new role, Trita was the co-founder of the National Iranian-American Council and has extensive experience in analyzing U.S.-Iran relations. And we are pleased to have him join us for this very topic today. The Honorable General Mark Kimmitt, a decorated brigadier general whose experience in both Iraq as Deputy Director for Operations and in Washington, D.C. as a former Undersecretary of State for Political Military Affairs will certainly inform the analysis he will share with us today on Iraq. General Kimmitt is currently the president of MTK Defense Consulting. Negar Mortazavi, an Iranian-American journalist whose perspectives on developments in Iran is only part of the reason as to why she was named by The Guardian as one of the top individuals on Twitter to follow for Iranian news. And Dr. David Pollock, director of the Washington Institute's Project Fikra and a Bernstein Fellow at YNAP. Dr. Pollock brings with him both academic expertise as evidenced by his Harvard PhD, but also State Department experience where he has been a Middle East policy advisor. So everyone, you should have question cards. Please feel free to pose your questions early on, because the earlier you pose them, the faster we can pose them to our fellow panelists. So without further ado, I will turn the discussion to Dr. Parsi.
Thank you so much. Always a great pleasure to be at the Gulf International Forum, and thank you all of you for attending, and to GIF for organizing this very timely panel. As to the question of whether the United States and Iran are on a path to war, or if this is just calculated brinkmanship, which means that we can be somewhat relaxed about it, it's not going to end up leading into a full-scale war. My assessment is that, on the contrary, this is an extremely dangerous escalation. We are right now in an illusionary lull. This is not going to stop here. The pattern that we have seen for the last 2.5 years, but particularly for the last 7 or 8 months after the Trump administration pursued the complete elimination of Iranian oil sales, which then led to counter-escalation by the Iranians, has now twice in 6 months put us only minutes away from war. And the driving forces of this escalation has not changed in the last couple of weeks. The United States continues to have a foreign policy in the Middle East that essentially its organizing principle is not stability, it's not the advancement of American security. The organizing principle of American foreign policy in the Middle East right now is revenge against Iran. This manifests itself through the maximum pressure strategy, which has further been intensified after the assassination of Soleimani, as well as political pressures. And the Iranian response to this has been, in the last 6 months, to counter-escalate. We have seen attacks in the Persian Gulf. We have seen attacks against Saudi Arabia. Most of them probably the Iranians were behind or had something to do with. We are seeing the nuclear escalation as well, in the sense that the Iranians are walking away from some of their commitments under the JCPOA, under Article 36 of that agreement, as well as a potential escalation by the Europeans by invoking the DRM, which could snap back sanctions, which probably would be the complete death of that agreement. None of those things have changed since the assassination of Soleimani. Even though both sides seem to have taken a step back, the actual driving forces that put them on the brink of war in the first place are still there, in many ways are intensifying. As a result, I do not know on what basis we would believe that there is not a risk for another confrontation, another flare-up, whether it is in the Persian Gulf, whether it is in Iraq in the next couple of months. And the question is, the third time around, can we rest assured that it will not lead to a military confrontation? If in the past the risk was primarily as a result of what was taking place in the oil sector in the Persian Gulf, now we have a completely new arena in which an escalation can take place, including an escalation that may actually not have been intended. In the sense that in Iraq right now, with the US troops being there, more troops being sent there, and the fact that the Iraqi militia that was targeted earlier on by the Trump administration may, independently of Iran, act to exact revenge on the United States. And the US may very well read that, correctly or incorrectly, of having something that the Iranians were behind it nevertheless. And that would then be able to spark a confrontation, even though that may not have been the intent behind it. So the amount of arenas and the amount of touching points in which escalation can take place are actually greater now than they were before. We are seeing some degree of diplomacy taking place, but nothing that actually amounts to the type of the escalatory mechanisms that are needed to truly transform this situation from one in which the escalation has taken a pause to one in which the risk of war actually is reduced in a systematic and a significant way. And I think I just want to say a couple of more points, if I have the time, when it comes to what this does to the region as a whole. There is an unquestioned premise in Washington that the United States, that the Middle East more or less would fall apart if it weren't for the United States, that it's providing the security architecture, and that we would see far more chaos in the region if the US didn't have the very forward-leaning military posture that it currently has in the Middle East. I think there are reasons to assess that with some degree of skepticism. I think it's quite interesting what did happen 6 months ago when the United States or Donald Trump decided not to go to war with Iran, even after oil fields in Saudi Arabia were targeted. We saw that after that happened, suddenly there was an increase of regional diplomacy, in which the UAE sent a delegation to Iran. The Saudis ended up having their own secret diplomacy with the Iranians through the Iraqis. According to the Iraqi Prime Minister, Soleimani was in Baghdad as part of that secret negotiation that was taking place. And what's interesting in all of that is that the option of pursuing that regional diplomacy has always existed. This is not something that emerged out of this. But the incentive structure for some of the countries in the region, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, seemed to have been that as long as they thought that the option existed for them to be able to push the United States towards a military confrontation with Iran, that was optimal compared to them actually negotiating directly with the Iranians, mindful of their sense that they didn't have enough strong cards. But once Trump showed that he's not going to go to war with Iran on their behalf, their calculations changed, and they started opting for diplomacy. So when the United States showed a degree of restraint, it also forced other actors in the region to do so and actually engage and explore diplomacy. Now that diplomacy may have been cut short with some of these other events, but I think it raises a question as to whether this rather carte blanche that has been given to some of the allies of the United States in the region actually has caused a scenario in which they are not taking the opportunity to stabilize the region and diffuse tensions and resolve their tensions with their rivals in the region through diplomacy, but much rather prefer to essentially rent the American military to do the job for them. If that is the incentive structure we have created, I think it would be doing ourselves as well as the region quite a big favor to reassess whether that actually lies in America's interest to provide those incentives to America's allies in the region. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Parsi. So we are going to move on to Negar, and Negar is going to give us some views about Iranian politics, and maybe she can shed some light on the domestic incentive structure for Iran to escalate with the US or not? Negar? Hi, can you hear me? Thank you, Dania. Thanks for having me here today. Thanks to all of you for coming in on this cold day. I just want to give you a little lay of the land of Iran's domestic politics, both from a political perspective, meaning the political factions, the parties that are operating inside the country, and also keep in mind that that's not all of Iranian politics. Of course, there is some opposition and dissent that operates outside of the country, but this is the main political body that's within the country, from the hardline factions to the moderates and also the reformists. And then I also want to talk about a little bit about the population and basically how the people feel about the political changes, the recent political changes. So the assassination of Qasem Soleimani basically worked as a rally around the flag factor for the political factions in Iran. We saw the moderates and the reformists, basically those who have been critical of the IRGC in the past, even some of Iran's regional activities, who had spoken out against Iran's, part of Iran's presence and activities in Syria and other places in the region. We saw all of those factions basically coming together in a united voice against, with an anti-American united voice against this happening. They condemned the US for the assassination and basically came out in what was seen as support for the IRGC. So it was basically a strengthening factor for the more hardline and more militaristic part of the Iranian political structure. We also saw the population that came out for the funeral in the millions in multiple cities in Iran, and this was just a month after massive anti-government protests in November, but then at the same time, in a way I think it surprised Washington, especially the White House, the way that part of the population at least came out for the funeral of Soleimani, which was centered around an anti-American message and also support for the core of the regime. Of course, keep in mind, if you come out for protests or rallies that are in support of the regime, you have safety and security, and obviously we're going to see much bigger crowds, but it doesn't mean it's all engineered or orchestrated, as we heard from officials at the White House. It was part of the population, a big part of it, that came out against the assassination of Soleimani. And the reason for his popularity beyond just the core of the regime, why we saw this massive population coming out, why we saw the factions that were critical of the IRGC in the past coming out in support, was because Soleimani was seen a little bit different compared to other IRGC commanders, because he was seen as a war hero fighting Iran's fights outside its borders, specifically with ISIS. The messages of support, the condolences that we saw from certain political figures and moderates and reformists were all centered around his fight in the Iran-Iraq war and also his fight against ISIS, which I can say with confidence is every Iranian's nightmare. Remember in 2017, there was a terrorist attack in Tehran at the parliament that ISIS took responsibility for. So the threat of ISIS, the fear of ISIS for Iranians is very real, is very near, and there's this general understanding among a big portion of the population, I would say. It's very difficult to say all of Iran because there is no such thing as all of Iran, but a big portion of the population, beyond just the supporters of the regime, see ISIS as a real threat, that Soleimani was fighting outside of Iran's borders, that if he wasn't fighting, would have came into Iran's borders, and that Iranians would have to fight inside their own country. So for this reason, and also there's an interesting trivia that is not much discussed here in the media, is that he stayed out of domestic politics, again, compared to other IRGC commanders. He was the rare or maybe one prominent commander who didn't get himself much involved in the political faction, in the domestic fights. He kept his file outside of Iran's borders, which gave him, again, more of that war hero image that we saw after the assassination, and more of this unity of different political factions
coming in for him as compared to other IRGC commanders who are seen more involved in domestic politics, domestic fights, in corruption schemes and everything like that. And then also again, I emphasize the reformists and the moderate factions because those are the ones who were in the past seen as opposed or critical to the hardline factions and to the IRGC, and the trend that has changed is that this assassination has brought them in basically behind, to some extent behind the hardline factions. There's this increase in an anti-American sentiment when I speak to reformists on the ground in Iran, some based abroad, that before, and this goes back to President Trump's leaving of the JCPOA, we have to remember it all started there. Before this new 2-year episode of maximum pressure, there was this clear divide between the moderate reformist factions who wanted more engagement with the West, more ties, more trade, more diplomacy, as opposed to hardliners who've been promoting tension and confrontation specifically with the U.S., basically creating this image of U.S. being the enemy. So what we would hear, for example, from reformists was a JCPOA number 2, Barjam Do. There was this discussions that this was a successful diplomatic engagement. It resulted in a successful deal. Now let's go negotiate more, basically what the Europeans have also been promoting. Let's go talk about the missile program. Let's go talk about Iran's regional behaviors. You would hear that line coming from certain reformist factions inside Iran. That has changed after President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, basically strengthened the argument of the hardliners, that the U.S. is not to be trusted with more negotiations and not to be trusted with more concessions. And especially after the Soleimani assassination, I heard this very interesting anecdote from, again, a reformist in Iran who said, until the assassination, I was of the argument that there's no problem if we even go and negotiate on our missile program, which is considered a red line for the IRGC and the hardliners. But right now, after this assassination, this is this reformist in Tehran telling me, I'm starting to think maybe we actually do need those missiles for deterrence, to defend ourselves, because it's very unpredictable what Washington, and especially this administration, the Trump administration, going to do. So this was seen as an act of war, basically, as a major aggression by all the political factions in Iran, and the result of it is a more strong, more hardline, more hawkish rhetoric coming out of Iran, and then less criticism of the IRGC. Now you'll hear less criticism of the Quds Force, of the regional activities, because frankly it's very hard to criticize a person who's already killed and is considered a martyr than when he was alive. So criticizing Qasem Soleimani's activities, which was Iran's regional activities before his assassination, was more doable for the opposition in Iran, but now it's much less. So we've seen a closing of the political space, I would call it, and this also connects to Iran's upcoming parliamentary elections, which we've already seen a massive wave of disqualification of the reformist candidates who've registered to run for the parliament. They've been disqualified by the hardline Guardian Council, and the upcoming election in February, we'll probably see less participation from the population, especially from the moderate and reformist constituents, and we'll see a more hardline, unified parliament forming after this, which is a part of it is a direct consequence of this atmosphere of tension. And what's interesting is that not just the criticism of IRGC, but just the criticism, the pushback of this closing of political space has been reduced. So we don't see much pushback, for example, to the disqualification of the reformist candidates as we would expect before this episode of tension existed. And then I also want to talk about the population a little bit, which is different than the political factions. Soleimani, of course, was a controversial figure, very polarizing. You hear Iranians from all the way from saying they were happy and they had a party and they danced, all the way to those who came out for his funeral, and many also in the middle somewhere, not accepting this assassination as an aggression, as an act of war, and feeling this threat that an escalation between Iran and the U.S. is going to basically threaten their livelihoods. We saw that in the November protests, the massive anti-government movement basically across Iran, and the very harsh crackdown of security forces. Hundreds of protesters were killed on the street with security forces directly shooting at people, very brutal, very deadly. And part of that was reversed, that sentiment was reversed with the killing of Soleimani. But again, on the night of the retaliation attack, Iran's retaliation attack against the US on the Iraqi base, in the morning, the Ukrainian passenger flight was shot down by an IRGC missile. So that also it was a re-emergence of the protests that we saw in November, this time led by the student and more of the urban middle class. So just to wrap it up, my time is up. We're going to see more closing of the political space, a more united and hardline parliament, and then next year going into Iran's presidential election, potentially this will have an effect on that. Rouhani's term is up, so there's a chance that we're going to see a hardline president this time for another 8 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Negar. Well, since arguably the Iranians have rallied around their flags, now we would like to see, have the Iraqis been rallying around their flag or any other flags in this unfortunate conflict? And I think General Kimmitt will highlight some issues related to Iraq's role in this conflict, how it may affect U.S. interests, and how it affects the confrontation with Iran. General Kimmitt?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
No.
Yeah, I'll just use this one. I spent about half my time in Iraq, just came back on the 23rd of December. I was supposed to be there now. It's a little bit too testy for me, so I didn't go back this time. Before I lay out sort of a little bit of history of how we got to where we are, I can't understand this argument that's being made that, as Negar made, that Soleimani was a war hero, not a politician. If he's a war hero, that means he's a battlefield target. He was not assassinated. He was killed on the battlefield. This is a man that was responsible for the killing. This is the man that was responsible for the killing of over 600 Americans through the use of his IEDs that were brought in. He's injured or maimed thousands of your fellow citizens. He has been responsible for tens of thousands of deaths inside of Syria. I agree, he wasn't a politician. Some would say he was part of the politics inside of Iran. I would argue he was a target on the battlefield. While I agree with many people in here that there was some question about whether that was the right thing to do to kill him on the battlefield, not really thinking through the consequences of that, that's not what I'm here to argue. What I'm just trying to argue is you don't assassinate a soldier on the battlefield. He was a legitimate target. He was, whether he was there to, quote, conduct diplomatic negotiations, or if in fact he was prepared to conduct reprisal operations for the Americans' bombing of the two popular mobilization forces. I don't have the intelligence to support that, and I don't think it's conclusive at this point anyways. So let me talk about Iraq and Iran, because I really don't know if the issue is Iraq and Iran, or if the issue is Iran and the United States, with Iraq in the middle. Iraq, unfortunately, has become the meat in the sandwich in the maximum pressure campaign, and the Iraqis resent that. Barham Saleh 2 years ago said, please take your fight elsewhere and not in my country, and that's pretty reasonable. The problem is, I think that we do have a bifurcation in the policy towards Iran that has a direct consequence on Iraq, which is, on one hand, we want in Iraq what we've always wanted, which is a free, stable, sovereign Iraq at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors. On the other hand, some in this administration would say this needs to be not only a policy, but the battlefield in the maximum resistance campaign. So since I don't know what the U.S. policy is on a day-to-day basis, and I don't think anybody here does, I'm just going to elaborate what I see as the fundamental disconnect in what we're trying to do there. So where does Qasem Soleimani fit in all this? I mean, obviously, you know his history. He rose through the security services inside of Iran. He was a war hero down in the Al-Fa in the Iraq-Iran war. We first started seeing Qasem Soleimani appear post-2003 inside of Iraq. At that time, we were working with the Quds Force on a bilateral, on a parallel basis in Afghanistan, and candidly, we saw what was happening there as somewhat helpful. There was this decent interval between 79 and where we are now, where the Quds Force actually was not seen as a sworn enemy of the United States, but actually somewhat of a parallel partner. So we had some real problems with Soleimani and the Quds Force as he started introducing the most advanced improvised explosive devices, the penetrator IEDs in Iraq around 2005. Nothing we put on the battlefield could protect against that. Again, hundreds of Americans were killed, so I offer no apologies for the fact that he killed my soldiers, so I don't hold a lot of sympathy towards him as an individual. He was a very smart battlefield commander. We had great respect for some of the Japanese generals. We had great respect for some of the German generals during World War II. That doesn't mean they were our enemies. It doesn't mean they were our friends. He was just a brilliant tactician. And I leave it to others to see whether his replacement will be as effective exporting the revolution to the rest of the region. So let's get to where we are now. And I won't talk about the consequences, but I think we can talk about what might happen. So we started seeing ISIS inside of Iraq around 2014. We saw that the Iraqi forces, because of some of the actions of the politicization of the Iraqi forces because of Maliki, we saw the battlefield performance of the Iraqi security forces, and it really was bad. The Americans came in 2014, but in sort of an advise and assist operation. But when the fatwa came out and said, in so many words, boys, get into PMFs, get into the Hashid, and hold back ISIS, one can't deny that the gates of Baghdad were really held by the Hashid. The Hashid were the best fighters, and candidly, they were the only fighters on the battlefield. And as we started to reconstitute the Iraqi security forces, it was really the Hashid that had done most of the heavy lifting. Over the past few years, we couldn't support the Hashid directly. The Iraqi security forces, the Iraqi government was in charge. And so in many ways, our support was to the Iraqis and the Iraqis that may have been working with the Hashid. I think the consequences of what happened on the battlefield, the virtual destruction of ISIS inside of Iraq, some of that must be, in fact, a large part of that can be attributed to a lot of Hashid getting in the fight and fighting and dying to defeat ISIS. But there always was a problem. There was always a problem because combination of post-withdrawal from the JCPOA and the end of ISIS, we always knew that there was going to be a problem in Iraq, what to do with the PMFs. There was an attempt to take the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Hashid, and bring them under the Iraqi security forces, the Iraqi security structure. The only way that could be done, because candidly, the influence of the Quds Force and individuals such as Qasem Soleimani was that they were set up as a parallel security service, ostensibly under the command of the Prime Minister, but in fact, de facto, very, very loose, and I'll talk about that if I have a moment. So what have we seen since about 2016 as the Iraqi government has been trying to wrangle with the question of the PMFs in general, the Iranian-backed PMFs in particular? We've seen a constant effort by Qasem Soleimani and his forces, who are all in charge of external operations, unlike the IRGC, inside of Iraq. We've seen harassment. Obviously, they have been firing rockets and missiles over American bases, over the American embassy, into the Green Zone, constantly. I've been there many nights when we call it the big voices screaming, saying, you know, duck and cover, duck and cover. But, you know, again, it's like throwing a basketball into a football field if you're trying to hit a target. Their rockets are not that precise or intentionally not that precise. The United States continued to go back to the Iraqi government and saying, listen, do not mistake our restraint for weakness. Time and time again, we said you need to bring the PMFs under control because there is a red line. That red line wasn't crossed when they attacked the Saudi oil facilities. That red line wasn't crossed when they attacked, fired over the bases. It wasn't the shooting of the tankers in the Gulf. That didn't trip the red line. The red line, which was never announced, but I think everybody understood, was when they killed an American citizen. Once they killed an American citizen, we started this downward spiral to where we find ourselves today. The killing of the American contractor and the wounding of 4 Americans at K2 was met with a reciprocal attack on 2 Popular Mobilization Force bases out near the Syrian border. That was met by protests in a massive level of all the PMF with their leadership visibly there. Not Qasem Soleimani, but Abu Mahdi Mohandas, Hadi al-Amri, Qais Khazali were visible in those protests assaulting the American embassy, where we have pictures of the walls that say Soleimani is our leader. So after the protests, I think we saw what happened then. Qasem Soleimani, I won't get into definitions, but Qasem Soleimani died on the airport road. That was responded to by the attack on Al-Assad base, where a number of Americans are going through concussion protocol, much like a football field, but at the same time, they're, as the president would say, they're probably going to be fine. So where do we find ourselves today? There's going to be the Million Man March inside of Baghdad, led by Muqtada al-Sadr on Friday. I haven't talked about the secular protesters that are trying to overturn the government there, but be glad to take that inside. But that's not related to Iran. But having said all that, the one thing that I know for certain, and Trita would probably agree with me, while the Iranians have avenged the death of Qasem Soleimani, the Iraqi PMFs have not avenged the death of Abu Mahdi al-Mohandas. So I would expect continued attacks on Americans. I would expect continued attacks on American facilities. Sooner or later, this is going to come to a head, and we can only speculate what that head looks like. So thank you very much.
Thank you, General Kimmitt. So definitely, so far, I can see that there's some agreement that it is more heading towards a dangerous escalation. Now, there's one party that are not in this discussion, yet are part of the conflict and could be targets within this conflict if it escalates, and that's the GCC states. And Dr. Pollock will go ahead and share with us his thoughts about the GCC's role in this conflict, what are the risks for the GCC states, and what are their interests.
Okay, thank you so much to you for organizing this very timely and important panel, and to all of you in the audience for coming out. We've really got a great turnout today. So I have 10 points that I want to make, and I'm going to make them real fast because our time is limited. And let me start with the point that usually goes unspoken, which is that not all the GCC countries are the same. Each one has its own particular relationship with the United States and with Iran, whether more friendly or more hostile or somewhere in between. And each one has its own tradition of diplomacy, and each one has its own particular internal drivers. So having said that, I am now going to talk about all 6 of them in general, because actually the common denominators, I think, in this particular context are stronger and more important than the subtle differences and nuances among the 6 GCC countries, but I'll be happy in the Q&A if anybody wants to talk about particular cases. So what is the general GCC reaction, Gulf Cooperation Council, the 6 Arab monarchies of the Gulf? What is their general reaction to the American assassination of Qasem Soleimani? And by the way, I agree with my co-panelists that he was a legitimate military target. Their reaction is a mixture, and I'm going to use a phrase that was coined by a colleague and friend of mine who was recently the U.S. ambassador in one of the 6 GCC countries. Their reaction is a weird mixture of suppressed glee and apprehension. On the one hand, I think that the governments and the elites in the region are afraid of Iran, are in some cases actively hostile to Iran, and in the particular person of Qasem Soleimani, he is viewed by the Gulf governments and the elites in those countries not as a war hero, but as a war criminal. Not against the United States, but against the Syrian people. Qasem Soleimani is viewed in the Gulf primarily as the man responsible for the massacres by Bashar al-Assad's regime against hundreds of thousands of innocent Muslims in Syria. So, on the one hand, the governments and the people, and I'll get to that point, that's point number 3 in just a minute, the governments and the elites in the GCC countries in general, I think, were privately quite pleased with this setback, as they see it, for Iran and in particular for Qasem Soleimani on a very personal level. And they were pleased to see that the United States finally did something directly against Iran. It's a little hard to remember today, but after the attack on Abqaiq and Khurais, the 2 major Saudi oil facilities back in September, Arab Gulf countries were complaining very loudly, both privately and publicly, why hasn't the United States done anything directly against Iran? Why are you leaving us out here? And now that we actually did something very dramatic, and I agree, very controversial, very provocative, maybe even very dangerous, but at least we did something serious against Iran, and that was in general appreciated by the Gulf governments. At the same time, of course, the apprehension comes from their sense that they could be targets of Iran's retaliation, as they were before Qasem Soleimani was assassinated, but maybe now even more so than ever. The third point I want to make, that was the mixture of suppressed glee and apprehension, is that at the government and elite level, the third point I want to make, and this is one that very few people, I think, know enough about, is that overall the population in these countries shares that view of Iran, of Qasem Soleimani, and of the United States. In other words, based on actual public opinion surveys that I have personally conducted in 5 of the 6 Gulf countries, the only one where I can't get a reliable survey company to work for me is Oman, but in the other 5, I did surveys as recently as November, just a few months ago, and you can read the results, if you want, in Fikra Forum, the blog that I direct at the Washington Institute. Actual surveys of the general public, not the government, not the elite, not the media, but the real people, the citizens of those countries. And you will see that in those countries there is overwhelming hostility toward Iran, toward Hezbollah, toward Ayatollah Khamenei personally. I didn't ask about Qasem Soleimani because I didn't know that he would be assassinated. But I think it's transferable. In other words, that hostility toward Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Ayatollah Khamenei, at the popular level in those countries, I think would certainly apply to Qasem Soleimani as the kind of personal incarnation of all of the things that all of the Arabs in those countries see as wrong with Iranian policy and dangerous to themselves. At the same time, there is, at the popular level, a lot of uncertainty about the United States. Ayatollah Khamenei is about as popular as President Trump, meaning not popular at all among the people in those countries, to be very honest about it. And American policy is not very much appreciated at the popular level in those countries. Mostly, I think, and I actually asked very specific questions about why you don't like American policy, and what would you prefer the United States to do, mostly because many of the people in those countries no longer see the United States as a very reliable partner. And I think that that's, given all of the zigzags of American policy in the last several years, that's pretty understandable. One last point about popular attitudes in those countries is that in some of those countries, in 3 of them, there is a significant Shia minority. 10% in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, 10% of the total population, probably about 10 or 15% in the UAE, mostly in Dubai, and 30% in Kuwait, right? Sandwiched right in between the Iranian and Iraqi borders. 30% of Kuwaiti citizens are Shia. And what I can determine from these surveys, and this is again not very well known, but important I think, is that the Shia population of those countries does not greatly differ from their Sunni compatriots when it comes to attitudes toward Iran, or toward Hezbollah, or toward the Ayatollah, or toward the United States. There are some differences. The Shia in those countries are more likely to see Iran as an important country that they need to have good relations with, maybe partly for self-protection. But they don't like Iran, they don't like Khamenei, they don't like Hezbollah, and they don't like Trump either, and very much in the same proportions as their Sunni counterparts. The one country in which the Shia are actually a majority of the population among the 6 GCC states, of course, is Bahrain. And I didn't do a survey of Bahrain this time around, but I did do a survey there 2 years ago, and I found that, very surprisingly, actually, the differences between Sunni and Shia in Bahrain are not that great. There are differences, but it's not as if the Shia population in those countries is some kind of pro-Iranian fifth column that is working against the stability or against the policy of their governments. That is not the case. All right, so now I come to point number 4. What are the threats specifically that the GCC countries think they might face from Iran right now? Well, it's pretty obvious. As I said a moment ago, Iran was already either directly or indirectly sponsoring missile and other attacks against oil facilities, against shipping, against civilian targets like airports in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and is well known to have a network of sleeper cells among the other countries as well, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, that have engaged previously in subversion, sabotage, assassination, terrorism, and so on. They tend to leave Qatar and Oman alone because those countries have better relations with Iran than the other 4 in general, but in all the other cases, the countries have faced very, very direct threats from Iran before anybody laid a finger on Qasem Soleimani. So what they see today is that Iran is perhaps going to retaliate further against them, try to break out of the American campaign of sanctions. Time is up. Holy cow, I'm only at point number 4. All right, well, I thought I had this well planned, but obviously I didn't. Okay, kind of like American Middle East policy. All right, so they're afraid, and I'll give you just one example. Just today, the Iranian media announced that the missiles that hit Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis came from Kuwait. That's what they say. I don't know if this is true or not, but that's what the Iranians are saying. And this is a way of telling Kuwait, you better watch out, guys. If you keep letting the United States use your territory and the gigantic military base that we have at Arifjan in Kuwait to hit us, to hit Iran, then you're going to be a possible target of our retaliation. Maybe not the United States, but you, Kuwait. So they're very afraid of that. So their reaction, I'm going to wrap it up with just a few sentences now, given the time constraints. Their reaction is very cautious. But I do think that today it is Iran that is reaching out to the GCC countries in an attempt to de-escalate more than the other way around. And that reflects the balance of fear. I think, in the region. I think before Qasem Soleimani was killed, along with Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and a few other people, I think it was the GCC countries that were reaching out to Iran, like the UAE and even the Saudis, more privately, and saying, look, let's de-escalate, we're afraid of you, we can't trust the United States to do anything, and so let's make a deal. And now that we got Qasem Soleimani and the Gulf countries are seeing that the United States is pretty serious about retaliating against Iran in a very direct way, it is Iran that is more afraid of what's coming next. And it is Iran, in the person of President Rouhani and others, and Foreign Minister Zarif and others, who are reaching out to the GCC countries and saying, well, let's de-escalate, let's make a deal, let's see if we can live together. Of course, the Iranians are still saying that the price for that would be to kick the United States out of the region. But I think now they know, deep down, that that's not going to happen. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank our distinguished panelists. As you can see, part of our mission here at Gulf International Forum is to air a diverse set of views, the good, the bad, the ugly. We welcome it all, even if we agree or disagree with them. So thank you so much, Negar and gentlemen, for joining us today on this very timely issue. Thank you, everyone.